let us delve into Quincy Jones's Chicago. So today we are going to visit the childhood home of film producer Quincy Jones, and then we are going to head to a mural in the Chicagoland area, or the Chicago area, I should say, that celebrates Quincy Jones through a likeness of him. And just a quick reminder, if you read the description of today's virtual tour, due to the violent nature of Quincy Jones's childhood as well as his recollections of his mother, this one is probably not appropriate for children if you do have any in the room or watching. So if you're new here, I'm Kelly. I run Chicago Movie Tours. My goal is really simple. It is to help you discover Chicago and its suburbs through film. So we'll definitely do that today by moving around the city of Chicago and actually a good 50 miles south of Chicago too. So if you're interested in more film and Chicago related events, do check out chicagomovietours.com and follow along on social media at Chi Movie Tours. All right, as we do with most of these virtual programs, let us head to the map. And we have 3 stops on today's virtual tour. You can see there, we are going to start a little bit south of the city of Chicago in Bronzeville, a neighborhood about 9 miles south of the Loop area. Then we're going to make our way down south, a little bit further in Illinois to Kankakee, Illinois. And then we're going to head back up to the city, to the Logan Square neighborhood, a bit north of the Loop area. Okay, so let's start with number 1, Bronzeville, and we're going to pull in a little bit closer on this stop with a different map. So there's Chicago. We're pulling in a little bit tighter, and you can see that area that I have highlighted in red. That is the Bronzeville neighborhood. And this area of Chicago has historically been known as the Black Metropolis or the Black Belt. And that's because it has been and still is the center of African American history on Chicago's south side, which again is about 10 miles south of downtown. And Bronzeville is an area where many African Americans settled during the Great Migration, which was that movement that began in 1916 when black families like Scott and Violet Arthurs, as you see here, would leave the Jim Crow South for Chicago because they were promised better jobs and reduced oppression. But if you know your history, the reality of that is far different. So right below me here, you have conditions in which some of these families would come to Chicago and find themselves, which are very much still repressive and still segregated from the white people within the city limits of Chicago. So here we have African American apartments in Chicago during the Great Migration. This is in the early 1940s. But you had families then leaving the South, moving up here, being restricted basically to live in these kinds of rundown, densely populated housing complexes. But there is good news. While there, Bronzeville residents worked really hard to create their own community. They have their own businesses, their own newspapers, their own monuments, as you can see on the far left, which still stands in Chicago, their own culture and their own, community institutions, many of which, of course, are still around in this area. And all of these things, the residents were working really hard to procure without the racial restrictions that were enforced in other parts of Chicago. So freely able to move in and out of these locations with these pieces of art, newspapers, etc. Also, Bronzeville's institutions grew to have national influence, rivaling in some cases those of New York City's Harlem, which would have been quite well known at this particular time as well. So who might you know from Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood? Well, here are a few of them. We have Nat King Cole on the top left. Below him, Louis Armstrong. There's Quincy Jones, of course, who's the subject of today's virtual tour. Next to him and below me, you have civil rights activist Ida B. Wells. We can also add to this list many other people. If you've been around for a little while, you know that I've done a virtual tour on the Marx Brothers, that comedy troupe that was quite popular in Hollywood in the 1930s. They lived in Bronzeville for quite a while. Poet Gwendolyn Brooks is also another one we can add to the list. Singer Mahalia Jackson, Dinah Washington, boxer Joe Louis, a man named Daniel Williams, that you might not know that name, but he was an African American who pioneered open heart surgery at a hospital in Bronzeville. So a lot of genius coming out of this area just south of Chicago. Okay, well, what do you get when you walk around Bronzeville today? Let me grab my video camera and we're going to head that way. So you look here, we have lots of historic Victorian era architecture, as you're seeing on the left-hand side of your screen behind these wrought iron fences. 19th century mansions, lovely houses. And the one that we're coming up on that I'll point out to you is the one with the red turret there. That is Ida B. Wells's home. We just talked about her as a civil rights activist who was next to Quincy Jones in the previous slide. But that's where she lived with the red turret. Today, Bronzeville is driven by entrepreneurial Black Americans who value this rich history that we're looking at through the architecture here. They want to keep it and its lessons alive for generations. So a lot of work going into that currently in the Bronzeville area. So isn't that lovely? All of these homes with their original facades, and in some cases, perhaps even the original color paint still standing. All right, so that's a little bit of a street in Bronzeville, but let's get back to our map, because at the topmost point of Bronzeville, that little pin there, 3631 South Prairie, that is where Quincy Jones lived for a part of his childhood before he and his family moved west to the Seattle area. Now, Quincy Jones was born in Chicago in 1933, and as I found out while filming here in the Bronzeville neighborhood, there is some debate within this community as to which house Quincy Jones actually lived in while he was here. So let's walk, because as I was taping this, one resident told me that this vacant lot that we're headed toward right now on the right was actually where Jones's house originally stood, and it has since been, as he puts it, torn down. So there's our vacant lot. But in a 1986 interview with the Chicago Tribune, Quincy Jones says this: "I lived in Chicago until 1943 when I was 10 in a little raggedy building at 3631 South Prairie." So if you just move a little further down from that vacant lot to this red brick duplex here, this is where Quincy Jones said he actually grew up when he lived in Chicago. So I guess I'll take Quincy Jones's word for it. And he has said that in more than one interview. So there's a look at 3631. So this is where presumably Quincy Jones would have lived. And I think that if my memory serves correct, I will give you another shot, yes, from across the street. But we do have quite a few green trees here that are enabling us from not being able to see very clearly. But anyway, there's Quincy Jones's house as he lived here in Chicago. So Quincy Jones's childhood, as I suggested in the opening or the introduction of today's virtual tour, was rough and scary, and that's how he describes it in several interviews. It was rough and scary, and he also tells us that he had the scars to prove it. Literally, on his right hand, which he has pointing at you right there, there's literally a scar, and on the left temple of his head. He tells us in interviews that at age 7, one time he went to the wrong neighborhood here in Chicago without knowing the codes of different gangs that were inhabiting that space. And he says that someone grabbed him, nailed his hand to a fence with a switchblade knife, and that's the scar that he still has on his left hand. And he continues in interviews saying they also stuck an ice pick in my left temple at the same time. So as you can imagine, 7, 8 years old, he would have been terrified and thought he was going to die. So his dad, who was a carpenter and also named Quincy, by the way, he came out and found those boys that were doing this to his son and actually hit them on the head with a hammer. So I have no idea what happened to them, but that's probably not a good situation for them either. But we do know with that hammer in hand that Quincy Jones's dad was a carpenter, but for several Chicago gangsters. So during this time, Jones and his brother Lloyd, who was a little bit younger than he, also saw dead bodies every day, as he tells us. He would see guys that were hanging off telephone poles with ice picks in their necks. He would see lots of Tommy guns just as he was, maneuvering in and out of his house. He would see stacks of wine and liquor. He would see big piles of money in different rooms. So a lot of sort of seedy underground things going on around Quincy Jones's childhood. So I would say definitely rough and scary as he describes it, right? So keep all of that childhood in mind as we head to our second stop on our virtual tour. We're going to go down to Kankakee, Illinois. So this is about 50 miles south of Chicago. It's also the former site of Manteno State Mental Hospital. So Manteno State Mental Hospital in 1940 housed over 5,000 patients and had about 700 employees. So it was a huge mental hospital. Look at it. It looks lovely on the outside, almost like a university building perhaps. But inside we've got a very different story going on. So let's look at what's happening inside Manteno State Mental Hospital when Quincy Jones was a child. So here are 3 newspaper clippings for you. All of these have to do with Manteno State Mental Hospital. So this hospital was in the news in 1939 because of a typhoid fever and dysentery outbreak that killed more than 50 patients. If you look at the headlines here on the far left, it says "Death at Manteno." In the second one, 4 officials are indicted in Manteno deaths, 3 hospital officials accused, and then finally indictments are laid to epidemic. So what happened was that in July of 1939, there were more than 500 patients and employees who were stricken with dysentery. Here is a front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune from 1939 as well. Reveal Manteno warnings. So this is where the report is coming out, why all these people are getting stricken with dysentery. And the report blames a faulty sewage system. So the sewage was allowed to seep into the wells from which the hospital would get its drinking water. And the conditions in the kitchen especially were described as disgusting and deplorable. Now, this situation was quite well known in Illinois, but it even made it into an issue of Time magazine, so it became nationally known as well with the headline, "Manteno Madness," from October of 1939. And I'm just going to give you a quick quote from that article itself, which is perhaps the most damning one, that patients lay moaning in bed. Others, whipped by mad fear, beat against the screened windows, grappled with attendants. Some of the attendants fell ill. All were panicky. Every night, kitchen boys and orderlies disappeared. Over 45 ran away in all. So a lot going on there in 1939, October of that year, with the dysentery and typhoid outbreak. So in addition to that situation, look at some of the other regular occurrences that were happening at Manteno State Mental Hospital in Kankakee. If you look at the one just to the left of my head there, it says 11 teaspoons and a knife taken from a stomach, but the man succumbs. So this is a man who was trying to eat 11 teaspoons and a table knife, presumably trying to die by suicide there, and that's indeed what happened. If you look right below me, you have 2 aged inmates escaping from Manteno Hospital. So in addition to the dysentery, the typhoid, I'm sure other illnesses that were going around, you have people trying to die by suicide, people escaping. So not a good situation, obviously, at this particular place. And I'm telling you all of this about Manteno State Mental Hospital because it figures heavily into Quincy Jones's childhood. So this is Quincy Jones's mother. Lovely woman. Her name is Sarah Wells Jones, originally from Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is where my husband is from, by the way. But she's one of those whose family moves from the Jim Crow South up to Chicago because that life that was promised to be better. So when she moved to Chicago with her family, she was, or actually not with her family, I think just with herself and her husband. But when she moved to Chicago from Mississippi, she was a founding board member of the Black-owned Federal Savings and Loan in Bronzeville. She also helped run a 400-unit housing complex with a nursery school and social programs. But at age 7, Quincy Jones and his brother watched as this lovely woman here was taken away from them and her family in a straitjacket, where she was admitted to Manteno State Mental Hospital in Kankakee. So Sarah Wells, educated woman, she went to Boston University, she spoke multiple languages, but clearly she was not well. And on his 6th birthday, Quincy's mother took his coconut birthday cake and threw it, as he says, for no discernible reason onto the back porch. And he knew something at that time was not right. And she would later be committed for dementia that year. And upon visiting his mother at Manteno State Mental Hospital, His brothers and his first sight was this. This is Quincy Jones speaking. When we first went into this hospital, there was a little blonde lady there standing up with no shoes on in her underwear, and she had a bowl of feces, and she says, "You shall have no pie." And I said, "God, let me get out of here," or "let me out of here." And so later, Jones would report his mother doing something similar to that little blonde lady. Obviously, a very disturbing situation that this 7 and 8-year-old kids found themselves in when they were visiting their mom. But much later in Jones's life, we do know that the mother was diagnosed properly. She was cured of these extreme symptoms. In the 1940s, she moved to Seattle with the rest of the Jones family. She would later divorce Jones's dad, but they all moved as a family that way. She would ultimately die in Seattle as well. That's where the gravestone is, right next to me. She lived a productive life. She worked primarily in religious education until she was 94, I think, is if you can look at the dates there on her gravestone. But Manteno State Mental Hospital no longer exists. There are some buildings there, I believe, that were part of the hospital, but the hospital itself is not functioning. And over the years, Quincy Jones has explained that everything he has done in his life, the good as well as the way that he is with regard to womanizing perhaps, all has to do with growing up without a mother. So his relationship with her, especially at that young age in Chicago and then going to Manteno State Mental Hospital, obviously left a very big mark on Quincy Jones. But that does lead us to Jones's accomplishments, because he does say all he has done in his life, and there are a lot of accomplishments. That's going to bring us to our final stop on today's virtual tour. So we're going to head from Kankakee back north to the city of Chicago, and specifically the Logan Square neighborhood, 2226 North Milwaukee, if you want to go visit this space. But before we look at the space with the big Quincy Jones mural on it, let's look at it as it was a few years before the mural was painted there. All right, so here we are in May of 2014, and you can see this side of the building with a pretty vacant parking lot there. From 2007 to I think roughly 2015, this is a plumbing business. It looked pretty much like this. Very nondescript, nothing on the side of the building itself. If we move forward another year, we have November 2015. You can see that there is some painting occurring on the larger part of that building, and then blue painting right next to that, a little bit closer to the train tracks. And the one that is blue is still there. It's a site known today for the famous Greetings from Chicago mural, and I'll show you that in just a second. So that happens in May of 2015, the Chicago mural. November of 2018, so 3 years later, we have a large mural celebrating beer and wine, Stella, I believe, and then you can see the Chicago mural a little bit closer there behind those cars. And then if we move to July 2019, Google Maps has actually got an image here of the guys working on the Quincy Jones mural. So you can see the scaffolding there, or the whatever that thing is that raises up and down, where they are painting over the beer and wine mural and putting the Quincy Jones ones up. So let's walk to this. I'll show you with the help of my video camera, and I'll give you a little bit of a bonus so we can see the Greetings from Chicago mural as well. So there's the L tracks, very close to these murals. Here we go. So there's the Chicago mural. Lots of people come and take their picture next to that. And I'm going to pause it for just a second and show you how big this mural is, because I'm going to put a picture of me standing between the C and the A in Chicago. That's how large the mural is. So these are both quite big murals. But if we get closer up to this one, you can see all sorts of Chicago mainstays. There's the Cubs, there's the Blackhawks, the Bulls, and then right here we have Save Ferris, which of course is a reference to Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Very much a beloved Chicago film. I think there's Buddy Guy, there's hot dogs, there's the Sears Tower, all sorts of things, the bean on the O. But right next to it, look over here at this huge mural. This is 30 feet high, 40 feet wide. This is Quincy Jones's mural. And this is painted by an Argentinian street artist who paints murals all over the world. You can see his name up there, Cobra, C-O-B-R-E. And he wanted to honor Quincy Jones after watching a documentary on Netflix called Quincy that was directed by his daughter, Rashida Jones. And he also said because there's no murals that solely are dedicated to him, especially in Chicago, his hometown, he wanted to make sure that there was something here to recognize him. So the artist wanted to originally paint this a little bit closer to downtown, the Loop area, but getting permission for that was a bit more difficult. So he determined that Logan Square, which is where the mural currently is, was a good place. And also it would gain a lot of attention from the CTA trains that are moving, as you saw how close those tracks are, right by the mural itself. And while sketching, only Jones's eyeballs, the two guys who we saw on the lift there that were sketching his eyeballs, a CTA train conductor stopped in the middle of the tracks one day and yelled, "It's Quincy!" And I have a clip of that. I think it's a little bit difficult for you to actually hear it, but anyway, that's what he's saying is it's Quincy, and then the artists are responding back, "Thank you."
Yes, please! Awesome, thank you! The train just stopped to watch my mural, man. Woohoo!
Yeah, I know that was difficult to see, but you can see just the eye, and that conductor knew just from the eye itself that was going to be Quincy Jones. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Can you imagine being on that train, just stopping in the middle of that bridge area? All right, so it speaks volumes, though, obviously, about Jones's popularity and the artist abilities that you're looking at with this massive mural. This took about a week, I believe, I read, to finish it. So how do you think Quincy Jones feels about his giant likeness? So I went digging on Facebook or other forms of social media to see if Quincy Jones was aware that this was actually in Chicago. And yes, an article comes out in Block Club Chicago that publishes a story, and Quincy Jones retweets it, or I guess reposts it if we're on Facebook, saying thank you, it's absolutely beautiful. So yes, he does know that this exists in Chicago and apparently really likes it. All right, so wrapping up, just a few more accolades from Quincy Jones. He's from Chicago's Bronzeville. His career spans 60 plus years. He is one of only 21 people in history who holds an EGOT. That is the Emmy, the Grammy, the Oscar, and the Tony, of course. He has 28 Grammys, 80 nominations for Grammys. He's a music producer, a musician, a composer, a music arranger, a singer, and a film producer, which is why I'm bringing him into the mix at Chicago Movie Tours. He does own his own production company, and he's worked in multiple genres, as you can probably see with some of our trivia questions at the front. Swing, big band, jazz, pop, soul, hip hop, rhythm and blues, and it goes on and on, of course. He's collaborated with Michael Jackson on Thriller. He brought celebrities together for We Are the World, if you're remembering that from the 1980s. He's worked with Ray Charles, with Duke Ellington, Clint Eastwood, Ella Fitzgerald, Oprah Winfrey. He's written music, produced arrangements for the movies that you see here below me, The Wiz, The Color Purple, In the Heat of the Night, and way too many more to name here. So you should just go check out his Internet Movie Database page, or he probably has a website as well. All right, I think that does it. We have hit Quincy Jones's Chicago, knowing a little bit more about his time in Bronzeville, as well as some of the things in his childhood that really affected his life in both probably quite positive and negative ways. We went to Kankakee, learned a little bit further about that, and then back up to that Logan Square mural that celebrates Quincy Jones with his likeness.